Question 1. When evaluating public education and outreach strategies for a community-wide emergency preparedness campaign, which approach best aligns with the principles of inclusive and effective emergency management? Option A. Prioritizing the development of detailed technical guides for emergency response, assuming that informed individuals will disseminate information to others. Option B. Launching a broad-based social media campaign and distributing flyers through widely accessible public locations. Option C. Focusing outreach efforts primarily on local news outlets and community leaders who have historically been receptive to emergency preparedness messages. Option D. Developing a comprehensive plan that includes a demographic needs assessment, stakeholder engagement, multimodal communication channels, and ongoing evaluation of message effectiveness. The correct answer is D. Developing a comprehensive plan that includes a demographic needs assessment, stakeholder engagement, multimodal communication channels, and ongoing evaluation of message effectiveness. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge for certified emergency managers, CEM, in developing effective public education and outreach strategies. The core difficulty lies in tailoring messages and delivery methods to diverse populations within a community, ensuring accessibility, comprehension, and ultimately, behavioral change during emergencies. A CEM must balance the need for broad dissemination of critical information with the reality of varying literacy levels, cultural backgrounds, technological access, and language preferences. The professional challenge is to move beyond a one-size-fits-all approach and implement strategies that are inclusive, actionable, and demonstrably effective in improving community resilience. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a data-driven, community-centered methodology. By conducting a thorough needs assessment and stakeholder analysis, the CEM can identify specific vulnerabilities and communication preferences within different demographic groups. This allows for the development of targeted outreach materials and activities that resonate with the intended audience, increasing the likelihood of message reception and adoption. Furthermore, incorporating feedback mechanisms and evaluating the effectiveness of strategies ensures continuous improvement and alignment with community needs, adhering to principles of responsible emergency management and public service. This aligns with the ethical imperative to serve all members of the community equitably and effectively. An incorrect approach that relies solely on mass media campaigns without considering demographic specificities fails to acknowledge the diverse communication landscapes within a community. This can lead to significant portions of the population being underserved or misunderstanding critical information, representing a failure to meet the ethical obligation of equitable public safety. Another incorrect approach that focuses only on digital platforms overlooks individuals with limited internet access or digital literacy, creating a communication gap and potentially exacerbating existing inequalities during a crisis. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence in ensuring broad accessibility. An approach that prioritizes the most vocal or easily reached segments of the population over those who are most vulnerable or marginalized is ethically unsound and professionally negligent, as it fails to uphold the principle of protecting all members of the community. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a comprehensive understanding of the community's demographics, socioeconomic factors, and existing communication channels. This should be followed by a stakeholder engagement process to gather input and build trust. Strategies should then be developed based on this intelligence, with a focus on multimodal communication and culturally appropriate messaging. Finally, a robust evaluation plan, including pre- and post-campaign assessments and ongoing feedback loops, is essential to measure impact and refine future efforts. Question 2. Stakeholder feedback indicates that during a recent multi-jurisdictional hazardous materials incident, the Emergency Management Agency was criticized for both releasing unverified information that caused public alarm and for withholding critical safety updates for an extended period. Considering the legal and ethical obligations of emergency managers in the United States, which of the following approaches best balances the need for timely public information with the imperative of accuracy and legal compliance? Option A. Establish a clear protocol for information verification and release, consulting with legal counsel to ensure compliance with privacy laws and defamation standards, and prioritize issuing accurate, timely, and appropriately caveated public statements through official channels, while utilizing social media as a supplementary, verified information source. Option B. Immediately release all information received from any source via social media to ensure the public is informed as quickly as possible, regardless of its accuracy. Option C. Rely exclusively on traditional media outlets for all public information dissemination, bypassing social media entirely to maintain control over the narrative. Option D. Withhold all public information until the incident is fully resolved and all facts are definitively confirmed, to avoid any potential for misinformation. Correct answer is A. Establish a clear protocol for information verification and release, consulting with legal counsel to ensure compliance with privacy laws and defamation standards, and prioritize issuing accurate, timely, and appropriately caveated public statements through official channels, while utilizing social media as a supplementary, verified information source. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in emergency management, where competing interests and potential legal liabilities arise during a critical incident. The emergency manager must balance the immediate need for public safety and information dissemination with the legal obligations to protect sensitive data and avoid premature or inaccurate statements that could lead to litigation or erode public trust. The pressure to act quickly, coupled with the potential for significant consequences, makes careful judgment and adherence to established protocols paramount. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach prioritizes adherence to established legal frameworks and ethical guidelines for public information dissemination during emergencies. This involves verifying information through official channels, consulting with legal counsel regarding disclosure, and issuing statements that are accurate, timely, and appropriately caveated. This aligns with the principles of transparency, accountability, and responsible communication, which are foundational to effective emergency management and are often codified in state and federal emergency management laws and guidelines, such as those promulgated by FEMA. Ethically, it upholds the duty to inform the public without causing undue panic or compromising ongoing investigations or response efforts. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately releasing all information received from various sources without verification. This fails to meet the legal standard for accuracy and could lead to the dissemination of misinformation, potentially causing public panic, hindering the response, and exposing the jurisdiction to legal challenges for defamation or negligence. Ethically, it violates the principle of truthfulness and could erode public trust in emergency management agencies. Another incorrect approach is to withhold all information until the incident is completely resolved and all facts are definitively established. While this might prevent the dissemination of inaccurate information, it fails to meet the ethical and often legal obligation to keep the public informed about significant events affecting their safety and well-being. This can lead to speculation, rumors, and a loss of public confidence, hindering cooperation with emergency responders. It also neglects the legal requirements for timely notification in certain types of incidents. A third incorrect approach is to rely solely on social media for information dissemination without a coordinated strategy or verification process. While social media is a valuable tool, its unverified nature can quickly spread misinformation. Failing to integrate social media with official communication channels and failing to fact-check content before amplification can lead to significant legal and ethical breaches, including the spread of false information that could have severe consequences for public safety and the reputation of the emergency management agency. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that integrates legal compliance, ethical considerations, and operational effectiveness. This involves establishing clear communication protocols before an incident, identifying key stakeholders, including legal counsel, and developing a tiered approach to information release based on verification and impact. During an incident, the process should involve 1. Assessing the information's accuracy and source. 2. Consulting with legal counsel on disclosure implications. 3. Determining the appropriate timing and audience for the information. And 4. Crafting a clear, concise, and accurate message that addresses public concerns while protecting sensitive details. This systematic approach ensures that decisions are not made in a vacuum, but are grounded in established best practices and regulatory requirements. Question 3. The audit findings indicate that the current community risk assessment process is heavily reliant on anecdotal evidence and historical data from the past decade, with limited consideration for emerging threats or the potential cascading effects of interconnected hazards. Which of the following approaches would best address these audit findings and align with current emergency management best practices and regulatory expectations for a comprehensive risk assessment? Option A. Focus the risk assessment primarily on the most frequently occurring historical hazards to allocate resources efficiently to known threats. Option B. Implement a multi-hazard risk assessment framework that integrates qualitative and quantitative data, incorporates scenario planning for both historical and emerging threats, and considers the interconnectedness of various hazard impacts. Option C. Expand the collection of historical incident data to include a broader range of past events, and conduct more frequent reviews of this historical data to identify trends. Option D. Contract with an external firm to conduct a one-time, comprehensive risk assessment report without establishing an ongoing internal process for review or updates. The correct answer is B. Implement a multi-hazard risk assessment framework that integrates qualitative and quantitative data, incorporates scenario planning for both historical and emerging threats, and considers the interconnectedness of various hazard impacts. Explanation. The audit findings highlight a critical gap in the community's preparedness: the reliance on outdated and incomplete risk assessment methodologies. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the Certified Emergency Manager, CEM, to not only identify the deficiencies, but also to recommend and implement a robust, compliant, and effective risk assessment process that aligns with current best practices and regulatory expectations. The pressure to demonstrate tangible improvements and justify resource allocation adds to the complexity. The correct approach, which involves a comprehensive, multi-hazard risk assessment utilizing a combination of qualitative and quantitative methods, represents best professional practice. This aligns with the core principles of emergency management as outlined by FEMA guidelines and the National Incident Management System, NIMS, which emphasize a proactive, all-hazards approach to identifying, assessing, and mitigating risks. Such a methodology ensures that the community's vulnerabilities are thoroughly understood across a spectrum of potential threats, leading to more targeted and effective mitigation and preparedness strategies. This approach is ethically sound as it prioritizes the safety and well-being of the community by employing the most rigorous and evidence-based techniques available. An incorrect approach would be to solely rely on historical incident data without considering emerging threats or the potential impact of climate change. This fails to meet the regulatory expectation of forward-looking risk assessment and neglects the dynamic nature of hazards. Ethically, this approach is deficient as it leaves the community vulnerable to unaddressed or underestimated risks. Another incorrect approach would be to focus exclusively on a single hazard type, such as natural disasters, while ignoring human-caused or technological hazards. This violates the all-hazards principle fundamental to comprehensive emergency management and NIMS, leading to an incomplete understanding of the community's overall risk profile. This is a regulatory failure and an ethical lapse in ensuring broad community safety. A third incorrect approach would be to delegate the entire risk assessment process to external consultants without adequate internal oversight or validation. While consultants can provide valuable expertise, the ultimate responsibility for the accuracy and applicability of the risk assessment rests with the emergency management agency. This abdication of responsibility can lead to assessments that are not tailored to the specific context of the community or that fail to incorporate local knowledge, representing a failure in professional due diligence and potentially a regulatory oversight. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the regulatory landscape and established best practices. This involves critically evaluating existing processes, identifying gaps, and then selecting methodologies that are comprehensive, adaptable, and evidence-based. Collaboration with stakeholders, data validation, and continuous review are essential components of this process to ensure the risk assessment remains relevant and effective. Question 4. Process analysis reveals that a significant cascading failure has occurred within a critical utility infrastructure network, leading to widespread service disruptions and potential secondary impacts across multiple jurisdictions. As the certified emergency manager, you need to initiate an impact assessment to guide the immediate response and inform subsequent recovery efforts, which approach best aligns with the principles of the Incident Command System, ICS, and Federal Emergency Management Guidelines for conducting this assessment. Option A. Establish a multi-agency task force operating under the established ICS structure to conduct a coordinated on-the-ground assessment of all critical infrastructure, environmental, economic, and social impacts, reporting findings through the appropriate ICS channels. Option B. Immediately direct a single, centralized agency to conduct a rapid, top-down assessment focusing solely on immediate life safety concerns, bypassing established interagency coordination protocols to expedite information gathering. Option C. Rely primarily on historical data and pre-incident planning documents to estimate the potential impacts, without conducting real-time field assessments or engaging directly with affected jurisdictions. Option D. Delegate the impact assessment responsibility entirely to individual local jurisdictions, without establishing a unified command or a mechanism for consolidating and sharing information across the broader incident area. The correct answer is A. Establish a multi-agency task force operating under the established ICS structure to conduct a coordinated, on-the-ground assessment of all critical infrastructure, environmental, economic, and social impacts, reporting findings through the appropriate ICS channels. Explanation. This scenario presents a professionally challenging situation because it requires an emergency manager to balance immediate operational needs with the long-term strategic implications of resource allocation and interagency cooperation, all within the established Incident Command System, ICS, framework. The challenge lies in ensuring that the chosen approach to assessing the impact of a cascading failure does not inadvertently undermine the core principles of ICS, such as unity of command, span of control, and modularity, while also adhering to relevant U.S. federal regulations and FEMA guidelines for emergency management. Careful judgment is required to select an approach that is both effective in the short term and sustainable for long-term incident management and recovery. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly aligns with the foundational principles of ICS and FEMA guidance on incident assessment. By focusing on a systematic, multi-agency impact assessment that leverages existing ICS structures and roles, it ensures that all affected parties contribute to a comprehensive understanding of the incident's scope and consequences. This collaborative approach reinforces interagency cooperation, promotes shared situational awareness, and allows for the development of integrated response and recovery strategies. It adheres to the principle of modularity by allowing the assessment process to scale with the incident's complexity, and ensures that information flows through established command channels, maintaining unity of command and appropriate span of control. This aligns with the spirit and letter of U.S. emergency management regulations that emphasize coordinated, all-hazards approaches. An incorrect approach that bypasses established ICS roles and responsibilities for a rapid, centralized assessment would represent a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It would violate the principle of unity of command by creating parallel or competing assessment efforts, potentially leading to conflicting information and confusion. This could also lead to a failure in maintaining appropriate span of control, as a single entity attempting to conduct a broad assessment without delegated authority would likely become overwhelmed. Ethically, it undermines the trust and collaboration necessary for effective interagency response, potentially alienating partners and hindering future cooperation. Such an approach would also likely contravene FEMA guidelines that stress the importance of integrated, multi-jurisdictional incident management. Another incorrect approach, focusing solely on immediate life safety impacts without considering broader infrastructure or economic consequences, would be a failure to conduct a comprehensive impact assessment as mandated by many emergency management frameworks. While life safety is paramount, a true impact assessment must consider all critical elements to inform effective resource allocation and recovery planning. This narrow focus would fail to meet the holistic requirements of emergency management planning and response, potentially leading to inadequate resource requests and a less effective overall recovery effort. A third incorrect approach, relying solely on historical data without real-time field assessment, would be a failure to adapt to the dynamic nature of an incident. While historical data is valuable for preparedness, it cannot substitute for current, on-the-ground intelligence in assessing the immediate and evolving impact of a cascading failure. This would lead to a flawed understanding of the incident's current state and hinder effective decision-making, violating the principle of maintaining situational awareness. Professionals should use a decision-making framework that prioritizes adherence to ICS principles, regulatory compliance, and collaborative problem-solving. This involves 1. Understanding the incident's context and potential cascading effects. 2. Identifying relevant stakeholders and their roles within the ICS structure. 3. Designing an assessment process that is integrated, scalable, and information-sharing oriented. 4. Ensuring that the assessment process supports, rather than bypasses, established command and control structures. 5. Continuously evaluating the effectiveness of the assessment and adapting as needed, while always maintaining a focus on the overarching goals of incident stabilization and community safety. Question 5. System analysis indicates that a certified emergency manager, CEM, is tasked with developing a comprehensive emergency management plan for a large metropolitan area. The CEM needs to accurately define the scope of emergency management to ensure all relevant stakeholders and activities are included. Considering the regulatory framework of the United States, which of the following best defines the scope of emergency management for this planning effort? Option A. Emergency management encompasses all 4 phases of the emergency management cycle: mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery, and involves the coordinated efforts of all levels of government, the private sector, non-governmental organizations, and individuals. Option B. Emergency management is limited to the immediate response phase of a disaster, including search and rescue and the provision of emergency services. Option C. Emergency management is primarily the responsibility of federal agencies, focusing on immediate disaster response operations and coordinating federal resources. Option D. Emergency management is solely the domain of government entities, excluding the private sector and non-governmental organizations due to their non-governmental status. The correct answer is A. Emergency management encompasses all 4 phases of the emergency management cycle: mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery, and involves the coordinated efforts of all levels of government, the private sector, non-governmental organizations, and individuals. Explanation. This scenario presents a challenge in defining the scope of emergency management within a specific regulatory context, requiring a nuanced understanding of how different governmental levels and private entities interact during emergencies. The Certified Emergency Manager, CEM, designation emphasizes adherence to established frameworks and best practices, which are often codified in regulations. A core competency for CEMs is the ability to accurately delineate responsibilities and authorities, ensuring effective and efficient response and recovery efforts. The correct approach accurately reflects the comprehensive nature of emergency management as defined by U.S. federal frameworks, such as Presidential Policy Directive 8 (PPD 8) and the National Incident Management System (NIMS). These frameworks emphasize a whole community approach, encompassing all levels of government, the private sector, non-governmental organizations, and individuals. This inclusive definition is critical for effective preparedness, response, and recovery, as it acknowledges that no single entity can manage all aspects of a disaster. Adhering to this broad definition ensures that all potential resources and capabilities are considered and integrated into emergency management planning and operations, aligning with the ethical imperative to protect public safety and welfare. An incorrect approach that narrowly defines emergency management solely within the purview of federal agencies fails to recognize the critical roles played by state, local, tribal, and territorial governments, as well as the private sector and non-governmental organizations. This limited view can lead to gaps in preparedness and response, as essential capabilities and resources outside of federal control are overlooked. Ethically, this approach violates the principle of comprehensive risk reduction and public safety by excluding vital stakeholders. Another incorrect approach that limits emergency management to only the immediate response phase overlooks the equally critical phases of mitigation, preparedness, and recovery. U.S. emergency management doctrine, as outlined in the Stafford Act and FEMA guidance, clearly defines these 4 phases as integral components of a continuous cycle. Focusing only on response is a significant regulatory and ethical failure, as it neglects proactive measures to prevent or reduce the impact of disasters and the essential long-term efforts needed for community resilience and rebuilding. Finally, an approach that excludes the private sector and non-governmental organizations from the scope of emergency management is fundamentally flawed. These entities often possess critical infrastructure, specialized expertise, and significant resources that are indispensable during emergencies. Regulatory frameworks and best practices, such as those promoted by FEMA and NIMS, explicitly call for public-private partnerships and collaboration with NGOs. Failing to include them represents a failure to leverage all available assets, potentially jeopardizing public safety and hindering effective recovery. The professional decision-making process for a CEM in such situations involves 1. Identifying the specific regulatory jurisdiction and its governing frameworks, e.g., U.S. federal, state, local. 2. Analyzing the definitions and scopes of emergency management provided within those frameworks. 3. Evaluating how different stakeholders, government levels, private sector, and individuals are incorporated into these definitions. 4. Applying this understanding to planning, training, and operational activities to ensure comprehensive and compliant emergency management. Question 6. The evaluation methodology shows that a post-disaster recovery plan is being developed, which approach best ensures equitable and effective recovery for all community members, considering the diverse needs and potential vulnerabilities exacerbated by the event. Option A. Focusing recovery efforts primarily on the most economically impacted businesses and residents, assuming their needs are representative of the broader community. Option B. Actively engaging all identified stakeholders, including vulnerable and marginalized groups, in defining recovery priorities and resource allocation, and incorporating mechanisms for ongoing feedback and adaptation. Option C. Relying solely on historical disaster data and pre-event demographic information to guide recovery resource distribution without direct community input. Option D. Prioritizing the reconstruction of critical infrastructure and public facilities based on pre-disaster assessments, with limited consultation from community groups. The correct answer is B. Actively engaging all identified stakeholders, including vulnerable and marginalized groups, in defining recovery priorities and resource allocation, and incorporating mechanisms for ongoing feedback and adaptation. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows a critical juncture in post-disaster recovery, where the effectiveness of planning hinges on robust stakeholder engagement and the equitable distribution of resources. The challenge lies in balancing immediate needs with long-term resilience, ensuring that all segments of the affected community, particularly vulnerable populations, are not overlooked. This requires a nuanced understanding of diverse needs, competing priorities, and the potential for inequity to be exacerbated during the recovery process. Careful judgment is paramount to avoid creating new disparities or failing to address existing ones. The correct approach represents best professional practice by prioritizing a comprehensive, inclusive, and adaptive recovery plan. This aligns with the core principles of emergency management as outlined in FEMA National Incident Management System, NIMS, and the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act, Stafford Act. Specifically, it emphasizes the systematic identification of all stakeholders, including those often marginalized, and their active participation in defining recovery objectives and resource allocation. This ensures that the recovery plan is not only technically sound, but also socially equitable and politically sustainable, fostering community buy-in and long-term resilience. Ethical considerations demand that recovery efforts do not disproportionately burden or neglect any group. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the most visible or vocal stakeholders fails to meet regulatory requirements for equitable distribution of aid and services. This can lead to violations of civil rights and discrimination laws, as well as a failure to address the root causes of vulnerability. Ethically, it represents a dereliction of duty to serve all members of the community. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes immediate infrastructure repair over social services neglects the holistic nature of recovery. While physical rebuilding is crucial, neglecting the human element, housing, mental health, economic stability, can prolong suffering and hinder overall community recovery. This approach may also violate regulatory mandates that require a balanced approach to recovery, addressing both physical and social needs. A third incorrect approach that relies on pre-disaster demographic data without incorporating real-time, on-the-ground needs assessments is insufficient. While baseline data is useful, disaster impacts can create new vulnerabilities and alter existing ones. Failure to adapt the plan based on current realities can lead to misallocation of resources and unmet needs, potentially violating the spirit and letter of recovery legislation that calls for responsiveness to evolving circumstances. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough stakeholder analysis, identifying all affected parties and their potential needs. This should be followed by a participatory planning process where stakeholders have a genuine voice in shaping recovery priorities. Regular monitoring and evaluation, coupled with mechanisms for adaptive management, are essential to ensure the plan remains relevant and effective. Ethical considerations should be integrated at every stage, with a constant focus on equity, fairness, and the well-being of all community members. Question 7. The monitoring system demonstrates a significant divergence in the recovery trajectories of the tourism and manufacturing sectors following a widespread flood event. The tourism sector, heavily reliant on infrastructure and marketing, shows slow progress, while the manufacturing sector, with more localized supply chains and adaptable operations, is rebounding at a faster pace. Considering the Certified Emergency Manager, CEM, exams focus on U.S. regulatory frameworks and best practices for economic recovery. Which of the following approaches best aligns with ensuring a comprehensive and equitable recovery for both sectors? Option A. Initiate a comprehensive needs assessment for both sectors, engaging with industry leaders, small businesses, and relevant federal agencies, e.g., FEMA, SBA, to identify specific barriers and tailor recovery strategies, including exploring grant opportunities and technical assistance programs aligned with federal disaster recovery policies. Option B. Focus recovery efforts exclusively on rebuilding damaged public infrastructure that directly supports the tourism sector, as this is a primary driver of its economic activity. Option C. Advocate for the tourism sector to independently seek private investment and loans, while the manufacturing sector receives direct public funding for rebuilding its facilities. Option D. Prioritize immediate resource allocation to the manufacturing sector due to its demonstrated faster recovery, assuming it will create ripple effects that will eventually benefit the tourism sector. The correct answer is D. Prioritize immediate resource allocation to the manufacturing sector due to its demonstrated faster recovery, assuming it will create ripple effects that will eventually benefit the tourism sector. Explanation. The monitoring system demonstrates a significant disparity in the pace and effectiveness of economic recovery and rebuilding efforts across different sectors following a major disaster. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires emergency managers to move beyond immediate life-saving and stabilization to address the complex, long-term implications of economic disruption. Balancing the needs of diverse stakeholders, ensuring equitable distribution of resources, and adhering to federal and state recovery frameworks are critical. The challenge lies in identifying root causes of the disparity and implementing targeted, sustainable solutions that comply with all applicable regulations. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a data-driven, equitable, and compliant strategy for economic recovery. This involves a thorough assessment of the specific needs and vulnerabilities of each affected sector, aligning recovery initiatives with established federal disaster recovery policies, e.g., FEMA public assistance and hazard mitigation grant programs, small business administration loans, and state-specific economic development plans. It emphasizes collaboration with local businesses, community leaders, and relevant government agencies to ensure that recovery efforts are tailored, sustainable, and foster long-term resilience, thereby adhering to the principles of good governance and effective resource management mandated by emergency management standards. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the most visible or vocal sectors fails to acknowledge the interconnectedness of the economy and the potential for exacerbating existing inequalities. This approach risks violating ethical obligations to serve all segments of the affected population and may contravene regulatory requirements for equitable distribution of disaster relief funds, potentially leading to audits and penalties. Another incorrect approach that bypasses established federal and state recovery frameworks in favor of ad hoc solutions, while seemingly expedient, introduces significant legal and compliance risks. Such actions can lead to ineligible expenditures, delays in funding, and a lack of accountability, undermining the integrity of the recovery process and violating the principles of lawful and responsible emergency management. A third incorrect approach that neglects to engage with the private sector and community stakeholders overlooks crucial local knowledge and buy-in, leading to recovery plans that are disconnected from actual needs and may not be sustainable, potentially violating best practices in community engagement and disaster recovery planning. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that begins with a comprehensive situational assessment, followed by a review of relevant regulatory frameworks and best practices. This involves identifying all affected stakeholders, understanding their needs and capacities, and developing recovery strategies that are both effective and compliant. Continuous monitoring, evaluation, and adaptation of recovery plans based on performance data and stakeholder feedback are essential for ensuring long-term success and accountability. Question 8. Governance review demonstrates that the Emergency Operations Center (EOC) manager is tasked with establishing the core functions for an upcoming high-risk event. Which approach best aligns with regulatory requirements and professional best practices for defining these EOC functions? Option A. Immediately deploy available resources to pre-identified critical infrastructure locations based on historical incident patterns. Option B. Initiate a comprehensive risk assessment to identify potential hazards, vulnerabilities, and impacts, using this analysis to prioritize and define EOC functions and resource allocation. Option C. Prioritize the development of operational procedures based on the most recent past incident, assuming similar threats will recur. Option D. Focus EOC functions primarily on communication and coordination, deferring detailed risk analysis to external response agencies. The correct answer is B. Initiate a comprehensive risk assessment to identify potential hazards, vulnerabilities, and impacts, using this analysis to prioritize and define EOC functions and resource allocation. Explanation: scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the Emergency Operations Center (EOC) manager to balance immediate operational needs with long-term strategic planning, all while adhering to specific regulatory frameworks. The pressure to demonstrate immediate progress can often overshadow the critical need for a robust risk assessment process, which is foundational for effective emergency management. The EOC manager must navigate competing priorities and stakeholder expectations, ensuring that decisions are not only expedient, but also compliant and ethically sound. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach, focusing on a comprehensive risk assessment as the primary driver for EOC functions, represents best professional practice because it aligns directly with established emergency management principles and regulatory requirements. Frameworks like FEMA National Incident Management System (NIMS) and the principles of the Certified Emergency Manager (CEM) program emphasize a proactive, risk-informed approach. A thorough risk assessment identifies potential hazards, analyzes their likelihood and impact, and informs the development of mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery strategies. This ensures that EOC resources are allocated effectively to address the most significant threats, thereby maximizing public safety and minimizing potential losses. It is ethically imperative to base emergency operations on a sound understanding of risks to ensure equitable and effective resource deployment. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that prioritizes immediate resource deployment without a preceding risk assessment is professionally unacceptable. This fails to meet regulatory requirements for preparedness and response planning, which mandate a systematic evaluation of potential threats. Ethically, it risks misallocating scarce resources, potentially leaving critical vulnerabilities unaddressed and failing to protect the most at-risk populations. An approach that focuses solely on historical incident data without incorporating forward-looking risk analysis is also flawed. While historical data is valuable, it may not account for emerging threats, climate change impacts, or evolving societal vulnerabilities. This approach can lead to a reactive rather than proactive stance, failing to meet the regulatory expectation of continuous improvement and adaptation in emergency management. An approach that delegates risk assessment entirely to external agencies without internal EOC validation is problematic. While collaboration is essential, The EOC has a direct responsibility to understand and integrate risk information into its operational plans. Over-reliance on external assessments can lead to a disconnect between the EOC's operational capabilities and the identified risks, potentially compromising response effectiveness and violating the principle of EOC accountability. Professional reasoning. Emergency managers should employ a structured decision-making process that begins with understanding the regulatory landscape and the specific requirements of their jurisdiction. This is followed by a thorough risk assessment that informs all aspects of emergency management, including EOC functions. The process involves continuous monitoring, evaluation, and adaptation of plans and operations based on new information and evolving risks. Stakeholder engagement and clear communication are vital throughout this process to ensure alignment and effective coordination. Question 9. Governance review demonstrates that a coastal community, prone to hurricanes, has historically allocated the majority of its emergency management budget to immediate response efforts and post-disaster cleanup. While these actions are necessary, the review highlights a recurring pattern of significant damage and prolonged recovery periods. Considering the principles of comprehensive emergency management and the need for sustainable resilience, which of the following strategic shifts would best address the community's long-term vulnerability? Option A. Invest heavily in advanced preparedness measures, such as large-scale evacuation drills and public awareness campaigns, while deferring significant mitigation investments due to their long-term nature and uncertain immediate impact. Option B. Increase funding for immediate response capabilities, including more personnel and equipment, to ensure faster deployment during and after a hurricane, and focus recovery efforts on rebuilding to pre-disaster standards. Option C. Reallocate a significant portion of the emergency management budget towards pre-disaster mitigation projects, such as strengthening infrastructure and implementing early warning systems, while simultaneously enhancing preparedness training and developing robust long-term recovery plans. Option D. Prioritize the development of comprehensive long-term recovery strategies, including economic diversification and social support programs, without substantially altering current response funding or investing in mitigation. The correct answer is C. Reallocate a significant portion of the emergency management budget towards pre-disaster mitigation projects, such as strengthening infrastructure and implementing early warning systems, while simultaneously enhancing preparedness training and developing robust long-term recovery plans. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing immediate needs with long-term resilience, a core tenet of emergency management. The challenge lies in prioritizing limited resources and attention across all 4 phases of emergency management, ensuring that actions taken in one phase do not inadvertently undermine progress in another. Careful judgment is required to identify the most impactful and sustainable strategies. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it integrates all phases of emergency management into a cohesive strategy, aligning with the principles of comprehensive emergency management as outlined by FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, guidelines, which are foundational for the Certified Emergency Manager, CEM, certification in the U.S. Specifically, it emphasizes a proactive and holistic approach where mitigation and preparedness efforts directly inform and enhance response and recovery capabilities. This ensures that the community is not only prepared to react, but also built to withstand and recover from disasters more effectively, thereby reducing overall impact and cost. This aligns with the ethical imperative to protect public safety and welfare through effective and efficient management of emergencies. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on response and recovery, neglecting mitigation and preparedness, represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This reactive stance leads to repeated cycles of damage and rebuilding, failing to address the root causes of vulnerability. It violates the principle of proactive risk reduction, which is a fundamental expectation of emergency managers under FEMA guidance. Ethically, it is a failure to exercise due diligence in protecting the public by not investing in measures that would prevent or lessen the severity of future events. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes mitigation without adequate preparedness, response, or recovery planning is also professionally unacceptable. While mitigation is crucial, an overemphasis on it can lead to a false sense of security and leave the community ill-equipped to handle events that cannot be fully mitigated. This represents a failure to meet the comprehensive requirements of emergency management, as outlined in federal regulations and best practices, which mandate readiness for all potential scenarios. Ethically, it is a failure to provide a complete safety net for the public. A third incorrect approach that focuses only on preparedness and response, overlooking the long-term economic and social implications of recovery, is also flawed. This leads to short-sighted solutions that may not foster true resilience. It fails to acknowledge the full life cycle of an emergency event and the importance of sustainable recovery strategies, which are critical for community well-being and are implicitly supported by federal disaster recovery frameworks. Ethically, it is a failure to consider the long-term welfare of the affected population. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a continuous cycle of assessment, planning, implementation, and evaluation across all 4 phases. Emergency managers should utilize risk assessments to identify vulnerabilities, develop mitigation strategies, create robust preparedness plans, establish clear response protocols, and design comprehensive recovery frameworks. This requires ongoing stakeholder engagement, resource allocation based on identified risks and needs, and a commitment to learning from past events to improve future performance. Adherence to federal guidelines, such as those provided by FEMA, and ethical principles of public service are paramount. Question 10. Quality control measures reveal that a critical infrastructure failure has led to widespread power outages and communication disruptions in a densely populated urban area following a significant natural disaster. While assessing the immediate needs, the emergency manager receives an urgent, informal request from a neighboring jurisdiction's mayor for a specific type of specialized rescue equipment that is currently in high demand locally. This neighboring jurisdiction is also experiencing significant impacts, but has not yet submitted a formal mutual aid request through the established interjurisdictional channels. The emergency manager is aware that deploying this equipment to the neighboring jurisdiction would temporarily deplete local reserves, potentially delaying critical life-saving operations in their own jurisdiction. But the mayor's personal appeal is compelling and emphasizes the potential for positive media attention if the equipment is deployed quickly. What is the most appropriate course of action for the emergency manager? Option A. Delay deployment of the specialized rescue equipment to the neighboring jurisdiction until all local needs are fully met, regardless of the mayor's appeal or the potential for negative publicity. Option B. Divert the specialized rescue equipment to the neighboring jurisdiction without informing local command or higher authorities, citing the urgency of the situation and the mayor's direct appeal. Option C. Immediately deploy the specialized rescue equipment to the neighboring jurisdiction based on the mayor's urgent request, while initiating the formal request process concurrently. Option D. Politely inform the neighboring mayor that formal mutual aid request procedures must be followed and initiate the process for them, while prioritizing local needs with available resources. The correct answer is C. Immediately deploy the specialized rescue equipment to the neighboring jurisdiction based on the mayor's urgent request, while initiating the formal request process concurrently. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a significant ethical dilemma for an emergency manager. The challenge lies in balancing the immediate need for resources to save lives and mitigate suffering against the established protocols for resource allocation, and the potential for long-term consequences if those protocols are bypassed. The pressure to act quickly in a disaster can lead to decisions that, while seemingly compassionate in the short term, could undermine the integrity of the emergency management system and create inequities in future responses. The emergency manager must navigate competing demands and potential criticisms from various stakeholders, including affected populations, higher authorities, and the public. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach prioritizes adherence to established, pre-approved mutual aid agreements and the formal request process. This represents best professional practice because it ensures equitable distribution of resources based on predefined needs and capabilities, preventing favoritism or arbitrary allocation. It upholds the principles of transparency and accountability within the emergency management framework. Following the established process, even when time is critical, is crucial for maintaining the trust and effectiveness of interjurisdictional cooperation. This approach aligns with the core tenets of emergency management, which emphasize preparedness, systematic response, and responsible resource management, as often outlined in federal guidelines and professional codes of conduct for emergency managers. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach involves bypassing formal request channels and directly diverting resources from a neighboring jurisdiction that has not formally requested them. This is ethically and regulatorily unsound because it violates the principle of mutual aid agreements, which are based on formal requests and reciprocal obligations, can create significant operational disruptions and resource shortages for the jurisdiction from which resources are diverted, potentially jeopardizing their own response efforts. This action undermines the trust and collaborative spirit essential for effective emergency management. Another incorrect approach is to prioritize the needs of a politically influential community over other equally or more severely impacted areas within the same jurisdiction. Based on informal pressure, this is a clear ethical failure, as it violates the principle of impartiality and equitable distribution of aid. Emergency management decisions must be based on objective assessments of need and vulnerability, not political expediency. Such actions can lead to public outcry, loss of confidence in the emergency management agency, and potential legal challenges. A third incorrect approach is to withhold critical information about the severity of the situation from higher authorities to avoid perceived criticism or to maintain control over resource allocation. This is a failure of transparency and accountability. Effective emergency management relies on accurate and timely information flow to ensure appropriate levels of support are requested and deployed. Withholding information can lead to under-resourcing of critical needs and hinder the overall effectiveness of the response. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such dilemmas should employ a structured decision-making process. First, they must clearly understand the established protocols and legal frameworks governing resource requests and allocation. Second, they should conduct a rapid but thorough needs assessment to objectively determine the most critical areas requiring assistance. Third, they should communicate transparently with all relevant stakeholders, including affected communities, neighboring jurisdictions, and higher authorities, about the situation and the resource needs. Fourth, they should exhaust all formal channels for resource acquisition, including activating mutual aid agreements and submitting formal requests. If formal channels are insufficient, they should escalate the issue through established chains of command, providing clear justification for additional or alternative resource needs. Finally, they must be prepared to document all decisions and actions taken, ensuring accountability. Question 11. Market research demonstrates that organizations often struggle to develop and maintain effective business continuity plans, BCP, that are both compliant with regulatory requirements and adaptable to evolving threats. Considering the Certified Emergency Manager, CEM, exams focus on U.S. regulatory frameworks. Which of the following approaches best ensures the long-term viability and effectiveness of a BCP? Option A. Prioritizing the establishment of a clear BCP governance structure, defining roles and responsibilities, and integrating the plan into the organization's overall risk management framework, with a commitment to regular testing and updates. Option B. Implementing the latest business continuity technology solutions immediately, based on industry best practices, before conducting a thorough business impact analysis or risk assessment. Option C. Adapting a generic BCP template from a reputable source and distributing it to all departments for implementation, assuming it covers most potential scenarios. Option D. Focusing on rapidly documenting all existing operational procedures and creating a comprehensive inventory of all potential threats, without immediate emphasis on testing or formal governance. The correct answer is A. Prioritizing the establishment of a clear BCP governance structure, defining roles and responsibilities, and integrating the plan into the organization's overall risk management framework, with a commitment to regular testing and updates. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an emergency manager to balance the immediate need for a functional business continuity plan, BCP, with the long-term strategic imperative of ensuring its sustainability and alignment with evolving organizational needs and regulatory expectations. The pressure to deliver a plan quickly can lead to shortcuts that compromise its effectiveness and compliance. Careful judgment is required to prioritize actions that build a robust and adaptable BCP rather than a static document. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it acknowledges that a BCP is not a one-time project but an ongoing process. By focusing on establishing a clear governance structure, defining roles and responsibilities, and integrating BCP into the organization's risk management framework, it ensures that the plan remains relevant, resourced, and regularly tested. This aligns with the principles of good governance and due diligence expected of emergency managers, promoting organizational resilience. Furthermore, this approach implicitly supports the spirit of regulatory frameworks that mandate preparedness by ensuring a systematic and accountable process for developing and maintaining continuity capabilities. An incorrect approach that solely focuses on documenting existing procedures without a clear governance structure fails to establish accountability and ownership, leading to a plan that is likely to become outdated and ineffective. This represents a regulatory failure by not establishing a robust framework for ongoing maintenance and review, and an ethical failure by not ensuring the organization is truly prepared for disruptions. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes rapid deployment of technology solutions without a thorough business impact analysis, BIA, and risk assessment risks investing in inappropriate or insufficient tools, failing to address critical business functions, and potentially violating regulations that require a risk-based approach to continuity planning. This is a regulatory failure, as it bypasses mandated analytical steps, and an ethical failure in misallocating resources and potentially leaving critical functions exposed. A third incorrect approach that relies on generic templates without customization to the specific organizational context and regulatory environment creates a plan that is unlikely to be practical or compliant. This is a regulatory failure, as it does not meet the specific requirements of the applicable jurisdiction, and an ethical failure in presenting a false sense of preparedness. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the specific regulatory requirements of their jurisdiction. This should be followed by a comprehensive assessment of organizational risks and critical functions, BIA. The development of the BCP should then be guided by a clear governance structure, with defined roles, responsibilities, and a commitment to regular testing, review, and updates. Prioritizing a systematic, risk-based, and adaptable approach over speed or superficial compliance is crucial for effective emergency management. Question 12. The performance metrics show that while individual agencies met their response time targets during the recent multi-jurisdictional wildfire, the overall incident objectives were not fully achieved, and there were instances of conflicting operational strategies. Considering the Certified Emergency Manager (CEM) framework and its emphasis on effective coordination, which of the following approaches best explains the root cause of this outcome and guides future improvement? Option A. Insufficient resources were allocated to the incident, forcing agencies to operate with limited capacity and impacting their ability to coordinate effectively. Option B. The performance metrics focused too heavily on individual agency response times, failing to capture the effectiveness of interagency collaboration and the achievement of overarching incident goals. Option C. The primary issue was a lack of standardized communication protocols and established joint operating procedures between responding agencies, leading to a fragmented understanding of the incident and hindering unified decision-making. Option D. The incident commander did not adequately delegate authority to subordinate leaders within their own agency, resulting in a bottleneck of information and decision-making. The correct answer is C. The primary issue was a lack of standardized communication protocols and established joint operating procedures between responding agencies, leading to a fragmented understanding of the incident and hindering unified decision-making. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced understanding of how to interpret performance data in the context of interagency coordination during emergencies. The core difficulty lies in moving beyond simple quantitative metrics to assess the qualitative aspects of collaboration, communication, and shared situational awareness, which are critical for effective emergency response. The Certified Emergency Manager (CEM) must apply a holistic approach that considers the dynamic nature of emergency situations and the complex relationships between various responding entities. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the multifaceted nature of emergency response coordination. By focusing on the establishment and adherence to predefined, mutually agreed-upon protocols and communication channels, it ensures a structured and predictable framework for collaboration, even under extreme stress. This aligns with fundamental principles of emergency management, such as unity of command and unified command, which are often codified in federal guidelines and best practices. The emphasis on post-incident analysis and feedback loops is crucial for continuous improvement, a cornerstone of professional emergency management as promoted by organizations like the International Association of Emergency Managers, (IEM), which oversees the CEM certification. This approach prioritizes learning and adaptation, ensuring that future responses are more effective. An incorrect approach that relies solely on response times or resource deployment numbers fails to capture the essence of effective coordination. While these metrics are important, they are insufficient on their own. For instance, a rapid response time might be achieved through unilateral actions that bypass established coordination mechanisms, leading to duplication of effort, conflicting strategies, or missed opportunities for synergy. This would represent a failure to adhere to the principles of unified command and could violate ethical obligations to ensure the most efficient and effective use of public resources. Another incorrect approach that focuses on individual agency performance without considering interagency integration overlooks the fundamental purpose of coordination. This can lead to a fragmented response where agencies operate in silos, hindering the achievement of overarching incident objectives. Ethically, this demonstrates a lack of commitment to the collective good and the shared responsibility inherent in emergency management. A third incorrect approach that prioritizes political expediency over operational effectiveness would be a significant ethical and professional failing. Decisions made based on political pressure rather than evidence-based coordination strategies can compromise public safety and undermine the credibility of emergency management efforts. This violates the professional duty to act in the best interest of the public. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with clearly defining the objectives of coordination. This involves understanding the incident's scope and complexity, identifying all relevant stakeholders, and establishing clear lines of communication and authority. The framework should then incorporate a robust system for monitoring and evaluating the effectiveness of coordination mechanisms, utilizing a blend of quantitative and qualitative data. Crucially, it must include mechanisms for immediate feedback and adaptive management, allowing for adjustments to be made in real time. Post-incident analysis should then be used to identify lessons learned and inform future planning and training, fostering a culture of continuous improvement. Question 13. Quality control measures reveal that while the jurisdiction's emergency management agency conducts numerous training sessions and exercises annually, there is a lack of clear evidence demonstrating a tangible improvement in the jurisdiction's overall response capability directly attributable to these activities. Which approach best addresses this deficiency and aligns with professional emergency management standards for ensuring preparedness effectiveness? Option A. Implement a comprehensive post-exercise evaluation process that systematically collects performance data, analyzes it against established objectives, and generates actionable improvement plans integrated into future training and resource allocation. Option B. Increase the frequency of all training sessions and exercises to ensure maximum participant exposure to emergency scenarios. Option C. Focus on documenting the number of training hours delivered and the number of personnel who have attended exercises. Option D. Rely primarily on informal feedback gathered from exercise participants to gauge the overall effectiveness of the preparedness program. The correct answer is A. Implement a comprehensive post-exercise evaluation process that systematically collects performance data, analyzes it against established objectives, and generates actionable improvement plans integrated into future training and resource allocation. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in emergency management, ensuring that training and exercise programs are not only conducted, but also demonstrably effective in improving real-world response capabilities. The professional challenge lies in moving beyond mere compliance with training mandates to a proactive, impact-oriented approach that validates preparedness and identifies areas for genuine improvement. Aligning with the core mission of the Certified Emergency Manager, (CEM) designation. This requires a nuanced understanding of how to measure the effectiveness of preparedness activities beyond simple participation rates. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach focuses on evaluating the outcomes of training and exercises against established performance objectives and identifying specific, actionable improvements. This aligns with best professional practices in emergency management, which emphasize continuous improvement and evidence-based decision-making. By analyzing performance data and feedback to refine future training and resource allocation, emergency managers demonstrate a commitment to enhancing actual response capabilities, a key tenet of professional emergency management, and a likely expectation within the CEM framework. This approach directly supports the goal of ensuring that preparedness activities translate into tangible improvements in the ability to manage emergencies effectively. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach focuses solely on the quantity of training hours delivered, neglecting the quality or impact of that training. This represents a regulatory failure by not adhering to the spirit of preparedness standards, which require effective, not just abundant, training. Ethically, it fails the public by providing a false sense of security. Another incorrect approach prioritizes the completion of exercises without a robust mechanism for evaluating their effectiveness or incorporating lessons learned. This is a regulatory failure as it bypasses critical components of exercise program management, such as after-action reporting and improvement planning, which are often mandated. It is ethically problematic as it wastes resources and fails to identify and address critical gaps in preparedness. A third incorrect approach relies on anecdotal feedback from participants without systematic data collection or analysis. While participant feedback is valuable, relying solely on it is a regulatory failure because it lacks the objective data required to demonstrate program effectiveness and justify resource allocation. It is ethically deficient as it may overlook systemic issues that only become apparent through rigorous evaluation. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a cyclical approach to training and exercise evaluation. This involves 1. Clearly defining measurable objectives for each training event and exercise. 2. Systematically collecting performance data during and after the event. 3. Analyzing this data against the objectives to identify strengths and weaknesses. 4. Developing concrete, actionable improvement plans. And 5. Integrating these plans into future preparedness activities and resource management. This data-driven, impact-focused methodology ensures that preparedness efforts are effective, efficient, and continuously improving, thereby fulfilling professional responsibilities and regulatory expectations. Question 14. Cost-benefit analysis shows that investing in comprehensive psychological first aid, training for emergency responders, and integrating mental health support into disaster response plans yields significant long-term benefits in community resilience and recovery. Considering this, which of the following approaches best aligns with the principles of effective emergency management and ethical practice in addressing the mental health needs of disaster-affected populations? Option A. Implementing a structured PFA training program for all emergency responders, establishing clear protocols for mental health support integration into the disaster response plan, and developing robust referral pathways for ongoing mental health services. Option B. Relying solely on external mental health professionals to manage all psychological distress, without equipping emergency responders with basic PFA skills or integrating their role into the initial response. Option C. Focusing exclusively on the provision of essential physical needs such as shelter, food, and water, while deferring all mental health considerations to post-disaster recovery phases. Option D. Providing immediate, uncoordinated emotional support to all affected individuals by any available personnel, without specific PFA training or established follow-up procedures. The correct answer is A. Implementing a structured PFA training program for all emergency responders, establishing clear protocols for mental health support integration into the disaster response plan, and developing robust referral pathways for ongoing mental health services. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing immediate psychological support needs with long-term mental health recovery, all within the constraints of limited resources and the need for evidence-based practices. The Certified Emergency Manager, CEM, must consider the ethical imperative to provide care while also ensuring that interventions are effective, sustainable, and aligned with established professional standards and regulatory guidance. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a structured, evidence-based framework for psychological first aid, that is adaptable to diverse needs and cultural contexts. This aligns with the core principles of emergency management, which emphasize preparedness, response, and recovery, and the ethical responsibility to protect the well-being of affected populations. Specifically, it acknowledges the importance of training responders in PFA, integrating mental health support into the overall disaster response plan, and establishing referral pathways for ongoing care. This proactive and integrated strategy maximizes the positive impact of limited resources by focusing on early intervention and sustained support, thereby reducing the long-term burden of mental health issues. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on immediate, uncoordinated emotional support without a structured PFA framework fails to meet the professional standard. This can lead to well-intentioned but potentially ineffective or even harmful interventions, as responders may lack the necessary skills to de-escalate distress or provide appropriate comfort. It also neglects the critical need for follow-up and specialized care, leaving individuals vulnerable to developing more severe mental health conditions. Ethically, this approach falls short by not ensuring the quality and appropriateness of care provided. Another incorrect approach that emphasizes only the provision of basic needs without acknowledging the psychological impact of the disaster overlooks a crucial component of holistic disaster response. While essential, neglecting mental health considerations can exacerbate existing trauma and hinder recovery. This approach is ethically problematic as it fails to recognize the interconnectedness of physical and mental well-being in disaster situations. A third incorrect approach that relies solely on external mental health professionals without integrating PFA into the initial response plan is also professionally deficient. While specialized care is vital, it can be delayed if not coordinated with immediate support. This can create a gap in care, leaving individuals without immediate assistance during their most vulnerable period. It also fails to leverage the capacity of trained emergency responders to provide initial psychological support, which is a key tenet of effective disaster mental health planning. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough impact assessment that includes the psychological and mental health needs of the affected population. This assessment should inform the development of a comprehensive disaster response plan that integrates PFA training for responders, establishes clear protocols for mental health support during and after the event, and outlines referral mechanisms for specialized care. Continuous evaluation and adaptation of these strategies based on emerging needs and best practices are also critical. Question 15. Assessment of how to best integrate immediate disaster recovery efforts with long-term community resilience and sustainability goals within the U.S. regulatory framework, considering limited resources and diverse stakeholder interests. Option A. Prioritize immediate infrastructure repair and economic stabilization, deferring long-term resilience planning until after the community has fully recovered from the immediate impacts of the disaster. Option B. Develop and implement a comprehensive, community-driven resilience plan that identifies systemic vulnerabilities, promotes equitable resource distribution, and fosters collaborative partnerships across all sectors, while ensuring immediate recovery efforts are aligned with these long-term objectives. Option C. Implement a top-down recovery strategy dictated by federal guidelines, with minimal input from local community members or organizations to ensure swift and efficient decision-making. Option D. Focus on enhancing the resilience of critical infrastructure sectors identified as most vulnerable, even if this means overlooking the needs of less critical but equally important community social systems. The correct answer is B. Develop and implement a comprehensive, community-driven resilience plan that identifies systemic vulnerabilities, promotes equitable resource distribution, and fosters collaborative partnerships across all sectors, while ensuring immediate recovery efforts are aligned with these long-term objectives. Explanation: the scenario presents a common challenge in emergency management, balancing immediate response needs with long-term community resilience and sustainability goals. The professionally challenging aspect lies in the inherent tension between these two priorities, especially when resources are limited. A CEM must exercise careful judgment to ensure that short-term actions do not undermine long-term viability, and that resilience efforts are integrated into the fabric of the community, not treated as an afterthought. This requires a deep understanding of the specific regulatory framework governing emergency management in the United States, particularly as it pertains to FEMA guidance and the National Incident Management System, NIMS. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly aligns with the principles of integrated emergency management and the FEMA emphasis on building a culture of preparedness and resilience. By prioritizing the development of a comprehensive, community-driven resilience plan that incorporates diverse stakeholder input and addresses systemic vulnerabilities, the CEM is adhering to the spirit and letter of federal guidance that promotes proactive, sustainable disaster risk reduction. This approach fosters collaboration, ensures equitable distribution of resources and benefits, and builds capacity within the community to withstand and recover from future hazards. It is ethically sound as it prioritizes the long-term well-being of the entire community. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on immediate recovery without considering long-term resilience fails to meet the ethical and regulatory obligations to build back better and stronger. This can lead to the perpetuation of vulnerabilities and increased future risk, violating the principle of due diligence. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes a single sector's needs over the broader community's resilience is ethically problematic as it creates inequities and can exacerbate disparities during and after a disaster. This neglects the holistic nature of community resilience. An approach that bypasses community engagement and imposes solutions from the top down is not only professionally unsound, but also likely to be ineffective and unsustainable, as it lacks local buy-in and understanding of specific community needs and capacities. This violates the collaborative principles embedded in NIMS and FEMA community resilience initiatives. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough assessment of the current situation, identification of immediate needs, and a concurrent evaluation of long-term resilience goals. This requires engaging all relevant stakeholders, understanding the specific regulatory landscape, and applying a systems thinking approach to identify interdependencies and potential cascading failures. The CEM should then develop a strategy that integrates immediate response with long-term resilience building, ensuring that resources are allocated in a way that maximizes both short-term effectiveness and long-term sustainability. Question 16. Comparative studies suggest that while both structural and non-structural mitigation measures contribute to community resilience, a comprehensive hazard mitigation plan, as guided by U.S. federal regulations, should prioritize which of the following approaches for critical infrastructure protection. Option A. Investing primarily in non-structural measures such as flood insurance programs and evacuation planning for all community members. Option B. Prioritizing the retrofitting of non-critical residential structures to improve individual home resilience against common hazards. Option C. Implementing a balanced strategy that includes robust structural retrofitting of critical facilities and infrastructure, alongside complementary non-structural measures like updated building codes and land use planning. Option D. Focusing exclusively on public education campaigns and early warning systems to inform residents about potential hazards, thereby reducing their exposure. The correct answer is C. Implementing a balanced strategy that includes robust structural retrofitting of critical facilities and infrastructure, alongside complementary non-structural measures like updated building codes and land use planning. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced understanding of how different mitigation strategies align with the overarching goals of emergency management as defined by U.S. federal regulations, specifically the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act, Stafford Act, and its implementing regulations, 44 CFR Part 201. The challenge lies in prioritizing investments and actions that offer the most effective and sustainable risk reduction, considering both immediate and long-term impacts on community resilience. Careful judgment is required to balance the immediate perceived benefits of certain measures against their actual effectiveness in reducing overall disaster losses and their compliance with federal funding requirements. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes structural mitigation measures that have a demonstrable and quantifiable impact on reducing the physical vulnerability of critical infrastructure and the built environment to specific hazards. This aligns with the principles of hazard mitigation planning, which emphasizes proactive measures to lessen the impact of future disasters. Federal funding, such as through the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, HMGP, often prioritizes projects that offer significant long-term risk reduction particularly for public infrastructure and facilities. Focusing on measures that directly address the physical integrity of structures and systems is a core tenet of effective mitigation, as it provides a tangible barrier against hazard impacts. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on non-structural measures without a comprehensive risk assessment fails to adequately address the physical vulnerabilities of a community. While non-structural measures like public awareness campaigns or land use planning are valuable components of a broader mitigation strategy, they may not offer the same level of direct protection to critical infrastructure as structural interventions. Relying exclusively on non-structural measures could be seen as a failure to comply with the spirit and intent of federal mitigation programs, which often require a demonstrable reduction in physical damage. Furthermore, an approach that prioritizes short-term, easily implemented non-structural measures over potentially more impactful but complex structural solutions might not represent the most cost-effective or sustainable use of limited mitigation resources, potentially violating principles of fiscal responsibility and effective program management. Another incorrect approach that focuses on retrofitting non-critical residential structures while neglecting critical infrastructure would be a regulatory failure, as federal mitigation funding typically prioritizes projects that protect public safety, essential services, and critical facilities. This would represent a misallocation of resources and a failure to meet the primary objectives of disaster risk reduction as outlined in federal guidelines. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough hazard and vulnerability assessment, identifying the most significant risks to the community. This assessment should then inform the development of a comprehensive mitigation strategy that includes a mix of structural and non-structural measures, prioritized based on their potential to reduce risk, cost-effectiveness, and alignment with federal program requirements. A robust cost-benefit analysis should be conducted for proposed projects, and the chosen measures should be integrated into the community's overall emergency management plan and land use policies. Question 17. The risk matrix shows a high likelihood of long-term economic disruption following a catastrophic wildfire event in a rural, tourism-dependent community. As the lead emergency manager, you are tasked with developing long-term recovery strategies. Which of the following approaches best aligns with ethical and regulatory best practices for sustainable community resilience? Option A. Prioritize community-driven economic diversification initiatives, workforce retraining programs, and support for local small businesses to rebuild and adapt to changing market conditions, ensuring equitable participation from all community segments. Option B. Rely on historical economic data to guide rebuilding efforts, assuming that the tourism sector will naturally rebound to its previous levels without significant intervention. Option C. Focus exclusively on rapid reconstruction of damaged tourism infrastructure and aggressively seek large external development firms to quickly re-establish the pre-disaster economic baseline. Option D. Implement immediate housing and essential service restoration while deferring detailed economic recovery planning until after the immediate crisis has subsided. The correct answer is A. Prioritize community-driven economic diversification initiatives, workforce retraining programs, and support for local small businesses to rebuild and adapt to changing market conditions, ensuring equitable participation from all community segments. Explanation. The risk matrix shows a high likelihood of long-term economic disruption following a catastrophic wildfire event in a rural, tourism-dependent community. This scenario presents a significant ethical and professional challenge for an emergency manager. The community's reliance on tourism means that recovery efforts must not only address immediate needs, but also strategically rebuild the economic base to ensure sustained viability. The ethical imperative is to balance the immediate needs of displaced residents with the long-term economic health of the entire community, ensuring equitable distribution of resources and opportunities for rebuilding. Careful judgment is required to avoid short-sighted solutions that might exacerbate future vulnerabilities or create new disparities. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a community-driven, equitable, and sustainable long-term recovery. This involves engaging all stakeholders, including local businesses, residents, and vulnerable populations, in developing a recovery plan that addresses economic diversification, workforce development, and infrastructure resilience. This aligns with the principles of comprehensive emergency management, which emphasizes proactive planning and building back better. Specifically, It reflects the ethical obligation to ensure that recovery efforts are inclusive and do not leave marginalized groups behind, fostering a more resilient community in the face of future hazards. This approach also implicitly supports the principles of good governance and responsible stewardship of public and private resources. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on immediate housing and infrastructure repair without considering the economic implications fails to meet the long-term recovery mandate. This would be a regulatory failure because it neglects the comprehensive nature of disaster recovery as outlined in federal guidelines, which mandate consideration of economic and social factors. Ethically, it is a failure to uphold the principle of equity, as it prioritizes physical rebuilding over the economic well-being of the community, potentially leading to long-term unemployment and outmigration. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes attracting large external investors for rapid rebuilding without adequate community consultation risks displacing local businesses and exacerbating economic inequality. This represents a regulatory failure by potentially violating community development principles and a failure to adhere to best practices in stakeholder engagement. Ethically, it is a failure to ensure fairness and local control over the recovery process, potentially leading to a recovery that benefits outsiders more than the affected community. A third incorrect approach that relies on outdated economic models for rebuilding, failing to account for climate change impacts on tourism or evolving market demands, would be a professional failure. This is a regulatory failure because it does not incorporate forward-looking risk assessment and mitigation strategies, which are essential for long-term resilience. Ethically, it is a failure to act with due diligence and foresight, potentially leading to a recovery that is unsustainable and leaves the community vulnerable to future economic shocks. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. First, thoroughly assess the full spectrum of impacts, including economic, social, and environmental factors. Second, engage all relevant stakeholders early and continuously to ensure buy-in and incorporate diverse perspectives. Third, develop recovery strategies that are integrated, equitable, and sustainable, with clear metrics for success. Fourth, continuously monitor and adapt the recovery plan based on evolving conditions and feedback. Finally, ensure transparency and accountability throughout the recovery process. Question 18. To address the challenge of enhancing community resilience against natural disasters, a certified emergency manager, CEM, is tasked with evaluating and recommending updates to the jurisdiction's building codes and standards, which approach best aligns with best practices in disaster resilience and emergency management. Option A. Conduct a comprehensive review of current building codes against established national disaster resilience standards and perform a localized risk assessment to identify critical areas for improvement. Option B. Advocate for the immediate adoption of the most advanced, state-of-the-art building technologies and materials, regardless of cost or local implementation capacity. Option C. Focus on implementing the least expensive code modifications that offer minimal compliance with basic safety requirements, prioritizing short-term budget savings. Option D. Directly adopt the building codes and standards of a neighboring jurisdiction that has not experienced a major disaster recently, assuming their codes are adequate. The correct answer is A. Conduct a comprehensive review of current building codes against established national disaster resilience standards and perform a localized risk assessment to identify critical areas for improvement. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing immediate community needs with long-term disaster resilience, often under pressure from stakeholders with competing interests. The Certified Emergency Manager, CEM, must navigate the complexities of existing infrastructure, economic constraints, and the evolving understanding of disaster risks. The challenge lies in identifying and advocating for the most effective, yet feasible, building code and standard enhancements that will demonstrably improve community safety and reduce future disaster impacts, while also considering the practicalities of implementation and enforcement. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a comprehensive evaluation of current building codes against established national disaster resilience standards, such as those promulgated by FEMA and NIST, and then recommending targeted updates based on a thorough risk assessment specific to the jurisdiction's known hazards. This aligns with best professional practice because it is data-driven, evidence-based, and directly addresses the core mandate of emergency management: to protect life, property, and the environment. By referencing recognized national standards and conducting a localized risk assessment, the CEM ensures that recommendations are both technically sound and contextually relevant, maximizing the return on investment in resilience measures and adhering to the ethical obligation to promote public safety. This approach prioritizes proactive mitigation, which is a cornerstone of effective emergency management, and correct approaches analysis, focusing solely on the most recent, cutting-edge technologies without a cost-benefit analysis or consideration of local capacity for implementation, represents a regulatory and ethical failure. It risks recommending solutions that are unaffordable, unmaintainable, or incompatible with existing infrastructure, thereby failing to achieve practical resilience. This approach neglects the principle of proportionality and feasibility, which are critical in public policy and emergency management. Prioritizing the least expensive code updates to satisfy immediate budget concerns, without a thorough assessment of their actual impact on disaster resilience, is also a significant failure. This approach prioritizes short-term financial expediency over long-term public safety and the fundamental duty to protect citizens from hazards. It can lead to a false sense of security and ultimately result in greater economic and human losses during a disaster, violating the ethical imperative to act in the best interest of the community. Adopting building codes from a neighboring jurisdiction without a specific analysis of how those codes address the unique hazard profile and existing building stock of the current jurisdiction is another failure. While interjurisdictional learning is valuable, a direct copy-paste approach ignores the principle of tailored risk management. It may result in codes that are either insufficient for local threats or overly stringent and costly, without providing commensurate benefits, thus failing to meet the specific needs of the community and potentially misallocating resources. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a systematic risk-based approach. This involves 1. Understanding the jurisdiction's specific hazard profile and vulnerabilities. 2. Benchmarking current building codes against recognized national resilience standards and best practices. 3. Conducting a cost-benefit analysis for proposed code updates, considering both implementation costs and potential disaster cost savings. 4. Engaging stakeholders, including building officials, developers, and community representatives, to ensure buy-in and feasibility. 5. Developing a phased implementation plan that prioritizes the most impactful and achievable enhancements. This process ensures that decisions are informed, defensible, and ultimately contribute to a more resilient community. Question 19. System analysis indicates that a rapidly growing municipality is considering rezoning a large tract of undeveloped land adjacent to a known floodplain and in an area with moderate seismic activity for a new mixed-use development. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the Certified Emergency Manager, CEM, professional standards, and U.S. regulatory frameworks for hazard reduction in land use planning? Option A. Conduct a comprehensive hazard impact assessment that evaluates the proposed development's vulnerability to flooding and seismic events, considering current and projected hazard data, and integrates findings into zoning ordinances and development standards to ensure appropriate mitigation measures are implemented. Option B. Approve the rezoning request based on the potential for significant economic growth and job creation, assuming that any necessary mitigation measures can be addressed by individual developers after the rezoning is complete. Option C. Expedite the rezoning process by relying on the developer's preliminary environmental report, which briefly mentions potential flood and seismic risks, but does not provide detailed analysis or mitigation recommendations, and deferring detailed hazard review to a later stage. Option D. Proceed with the rezoning based on historical development patterns in similar areas, without conducting specific hazard assessments for this particular site, as past development has not resulted in significant disaster losses. The correct answer is A. Conduct a comprehensive hazard impact assessment that evaluates the proposed development's vulnerability to flooding and seismic events, considering current and projected hazard data, and integrates findings into zoning ordinances and development standards to ensure appropriate mitigation measures are implemented. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing competing interests, public safety and hazard reduction against economic development and property rights. Emergency managers must navigate complex regulatory landscapes and stakeholder demands to implement effective land use planning that mitigates risk without unduly hindering growth. The challenge lies in translating scientific hazard data into actionable zoning ordinances and development standards that are both legally defensible and practically implementable. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a comprehensive impact assessment that systematically evaluates the potential consequences of proposed land use changes on hazard susceptibility and community resilience. This aligns with best professional practices in emergency management, emphasizing a proactive, data-driven, and holistic approach to risk reduction. Specifically, it adheres to the principles of the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, and relevant state and local land use planning statutes, which mandate consideration of environmental impacts, including those related to natural hazards, before major development decisions are made. This approach ensures that decisions are informed by scientific evidence and consider the long-term safety and well-being of the community, fulfilling the ethical obligation to protect public life and property. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach involves prioritizing immediate economic benefits over potential long-term hazard risks. This fails to comply with regulatory frameworks that require thorough hazard analysis and mitigation planning as part of land use decisions. Ethically, it represents a failure to uphold the duty of care to protect the public from foreseeable harm. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on historical data without considering future climate change projections or evolving hazard models. This is a regulatory failure, as it neglects current scientific understanding and best practices in hazard assessment, which increasingly incorporate forward-looking analyses. It also demonstrates a lack of professional diligence in anticipating and preparing for future risks. A third incorrect approach is to exclude input from relevant scientific and emergency management agencies during the planning process. This is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. Regulations often mandate interagency coordination and consultation. Excluding these critical stakeholders means vital expertise regarding hazard identification, risk assessment, and mitigation strategies is ignored, leading to potentially inadequate or even counterproductive land use decisions. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making process that begins with clearly defining the scope of the land use proposal and the associated hazards. This involves gathering and analyzing all relevant data, including hazard maps, vulnerability assessments, and scientific projections. Next, potential impacts on public safety, infrastructure, and the environment must be thoroughly evaluated. Stakeholder engagement, including consultation with scientific experts, emergency managers, and the public, is crucial at this stage. Finally, proposed mitigation measures and zoning adjustments should be developed and assessed for their effectiveness, feasibility, and regulatory compliance before a final recommendation or decision is made. This iterative process ensures that land use planning is robust, defensible, and effectively contributes to community resilience. Question 20. The monitoring system demonstrates a significant increase in reported incidents of severe weather preparedness confusion among residents in a specific county, particularly among elderly populations and those with limited English proficiency. The County Emergency Management Agency needs to implement a new public education and outreach strategy to address this gap. Which of the following approaches would be most effective and compliant with best practices for emergency preparedness outreach? Option A. Focus all outreach efforts on local news broadcasts, assuming that television is the most widely consumed media for emergency information across all demographic groups. Option B. Develop and distribute a comprehensive preparedness guide in multiple languages, including large print and audio formats, and partner with local community centers, faith-based organizations, and senior living facilities to conduct in-person workshops and distribute materials directly to residents. Option C. Rely on the county's existing website and email newsletter to disseminate preparedness information, as these are the primary communication channels for official county updates. Option D. Launch a targeted social media campaign featuring short, engaging videos and infographics on weather preparedness, assuming that most residents, including the elderly, are active online. The correct answer is B. Develop and distribute a comprehensive preparedness guide in multiple languages, including large print and audio formats, and partner with local community centers, faith-based organizations, and senior living facilities to conduct in-person workshops and distribute materials directly to residents. Explanation: this scenario presents a common challenge in emergency management, effectively communicating critical information to a diverse public with varying needs and access points. The professionally challenging aspect lies in ensuring that outreach strategies are not only comprehensive but also equitable and accessible, reaching all segments of the population, including vulnerable groups. This requires careful judgment to balance broad messaging with targeted interventions. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it aligns with the core principles of public education and outreach mandated by emergency management frameworks, such as those emphasized by FEMA in the United States. Specifically, it prioritizes a multifaceted strategy that leverages various communication channels and formats to reach a wide audience. This includes utilizing accessible formats for individuals with disabilities, engaging community leaders to disseminate information within specific cultural groups, and employing both traditional and digital media. This approach ensures that information is not only disseminated, but also understood and actionable by the intended recipients, fostering community resilience and preparedness. It reflects a commitment to inclusivity and the ethical obligation to protect all members of the community. An incorrect approach that relies solely on digital media platforms would fail to reach individuals without reliable internet access or digital literacy, creating an information gap and potentially leaving vulnerable populations unprepared. This represents a regulatory failure by not adhering to accessibility requirements and an ethical failure by not ensuring equitable access to vital safety information. Another incorrect approach that focuses only on broad, generic public service announcements would lack the specificity needed to address the unique risks and needs of different communities, leading to ineffective preparedness and a failure to meet the obligation to provide tailored guidance. This is a failure in both regulatory compliance regarding targeted outreach and ethical responsibility to address diverse community needs. A third incorrect approach that prioritizes outreach only to known community leaders without direct engagement with the broader public would miss opportunities to empower individuals directly and could inadvertently exclude segments of the population not represented by those leaders. This demonstrates a failure to implement comprehensive outreach strategies as required by best practices and regulations. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough risk assessment and community vulnerability analysis. This analysis should inform the selection of communication channels and messaging strategies, ensuring they are tailored to the specific demographics, cultural contexts, and access capabilities of the target population. Continuous evaluation and feedback mechanisms are crucial to adapt strategies and ensure their effectiveness and inclusivity.